Okay. Can everyone hear me? People I can
Yeah,
see?
we can.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to start my introduction. I'll begin by introducing myself. I'm Karen Ball from the Department of English and Film Studies, and it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Rebecca Comay from the University of Toronto, whose accomplishments, I have to say, I can apprehend them all, but I can't comprehend them all because in keeping with the Kantian sublime, there are so many. And when you think about all the works that she's published and of such high quality, it really is overwhelming, but in the best way. So I'll begin by reducing her to information, and then I'm going to decry that afterwards in maybe not so typical deconstructive style. Yeah, my introduction should take about 10-12 minutes, I'd say, in case you start getting worried at minute 9, like, oh my god, she's talking too long. Well, okay, so I'll begin with a territorial acknowledgement. The University of Alberta, its buildings, labs, and research stations are primarily located on the traditional territory of Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, and Ojibwe and Anishinaabe nations, lands that are now known as part of Treaties 6, 7, and 8 in the homeland of the Métis. The University of Alberta respects the sovereignty, lands, histories, languages, knowledge systems, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit nations. All right, so here's part 1, Comay's information. It's basically about her accomplishments that I gleaned from what might be an older CV because it's from 2019. And so Rebecca, maybe you'll want to correct me about which of your finished manuscripts are now actually out or in press. All right, so this is a fragment, romantic idealist fragment almost of her accomplishments. And I think you'll be kind of amazed, like I am, about the sweep of her accomplishments and the breadth of knowledge that it represents. From 1974 to 75, she studied Jewish philosophy and Hebrew at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She earned her BA from the University of Toronto in philosophy, classics, and Near Eastern studies. In 1979, she earned a master's from the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Literatures with a specialization in Egyptology and Assyriology from Yale University. 1986, she completed her PhD at the University of Toronto, writing on Hegel and Heidegger, and the bad infinite, which is one of my favorite ideas. And from what I gather, she's been a full professor since 2007. Is that right, Rebecca? Or at least that's what I took from your CV. Okay. I feel like you've always been a full professor at the Department of Philosophy, but she's also affiliated with the Center for Comparative Literature and the program in Literature and Critical Theory at the University of Toronto. In addition, she's an associate member of the German department and the Center for Jewish Studies. She's also been cross-appointed to the Center of Comparative Literature, and since 2015, she's also been a professor in the Faculty of Philosophy at the European Graduate School in Switzerland. While teaching at the University of Toronto, she launched the program in Literature and Critical Theory. That was in 2012, which was formerly the Literary Studies program. And she just co-designed the curriculum with Eric Hasden and also co-coordinated it with him. Before the pandemic, she was honored with a succession of visiting professorship with comparative literature at NYU a couple of times, at the American University in Beirut, at the International Center for Critical Theory at Peking University, the Department of Germanic Languages and Literature at Princeton, the Graduate Center for Theory and Criticism at University of Western Ontario, and the Department of Comparative Literature at SUNY Buffalo. She published The Dash, The Other Side of Absolute Knowing, that she co-wrote with Frank Ruda, and it was published in 2018, which has already been translated into multiple languages. Her 2011 book, Morning Sickness, Hegel and the French Revolution, has been widely reviewed, translated into multiple languages, and has served as the honored focus of several symposia and panels. She also co-edited the 2017 essay collection, Hegel and Resistance. She edited Lost in the Archives in 2002, and co-edited with John McUmber a 1999 collection entitled Endings, Questions of Memory in Hegel and Heidegger. As of spring 2019, which is the CV I have, having recently finished a manuscript entitled Marx's Dialectic, 3 Studies on the 18th Brumaire, co-authored with Andrew Cole and Frank Ruda, Dr. Comay has been completing 3 others: Deadlines, Literally, Dramaturgy of the Dialectic, and First Persons, co-authored with Ian Balfour. She has, moreover, published at least 55 articles or chapters and probably the 4 additional that I counted that are forthcoming are out by now. And this list features a 2012 interview with former University of Alberta student Joshua Nichols, who many remember probably if you're in political science and you're among the audience. As you will note from the 3 lectures she's delivering, her many specializations include 19th century German philosophy, Marxism in the Frankfurt School, psychoanalysis, contemporary French philosophy, contemporary art and art theory, literary theory, trauma and memory studies, political philosophy, theater, and performance studies. But it might interest you to know that along with her fluency in French, she has reading knowledge of German, Greek, Biblical Hebrew, Akkadian, Ancient Egyptian, Sumerian, and Coptic. So if you want to ask any questions in Sumerian, I'm sure she'd be happy to answer. No, I'm just kidding. But that was one of the many things that really impressed me. That's, I don't meet people who know Coptic and Sumerian every day. All right. So I guess the premise of my introduction, the less informational part of it, is the fact that when Christopher Bracken and I were talking about our application on her behalf to bring her in as a distinguished visitor, we had to figure out how to represent what she does. And this presented a certain conundrum because I read her as one of the best examples of deconstructive writing that I've ever read. The way that she reads Hegel, I cut my teeth on that stuff when I first started thinking about deconstruction back when I was a wee lass, and my first seminar paper was on Hegel's phenomenology. So the fact that she can read such a difficult text so gracefully and so insightfully, and write so powerfully about it, it has always been a source of amazement for me. You can dwell on every sentence she writes. Every sentence is just brimming with eloquence, which reminds me of how I feel when I read Proust as well. So I hope that comparison doesn't embarrass you, Rebecca. But what I wanted to say is that we wanted to represent her as an example or somebody who models the practice of artful reading, because what else can you call deconstructive reading except something that takes seriously writing as art and wants to do justice to it as art by writing artfully and reading artfully. The reading artfully translates into an artful writing, and that's precisely, I think, what you would find if you were to read her books and essays. That's what I have found. And this is the conundrum that was presented to us in a university which tends, like most market actors, to focus on quantitative metrics at the expense of quality. How do you portray the work of such an erudite, elegant, and cosmopolitan thinker, someone who writes about difficult texts without ever becoming reductive, who embraces ambivalence and its reserves, who dances into abysses without hesitation and somehow manages to take her readers with her when she climbs up and out again? It is a rush to try to keep up with a style that matches the complexity of its content, whether this content be Hegel, Benjamin, or Proust, among so many others. When Chris Bracken was working on the application for the Distinguished Visitor funding, we had to imagine an audience that in certain respects inhabits the kind of moment that Walter Benjamin also attested to when he affirmed the historical sensibility of Baudelaire over and against Bergson in some motifs on Baudelaire. As you might recall, for Benjamin, the shift taking place in the reception of lyric poetry meant that Baudelaire wrote for an audience that, as he himself self-consciously recognized, would not appreciate him. Without getting into the specifics of Benjamin's theory of Erlebnisse or fleeting experience taking the place of Erfahrung or traditionally imbricated collective experience, Benjamin delineates this audience with a Lukácsian swerve in the storyteller in the course of remarking the rise of information at the expense of storytelling. I have always found this particular decline narrative in Benjamin to be compelling because the format of information is defined by its relentless simultaneity and seriality. We are bombarded by it in news, advertising, and workplace emails. There seems to be no recognition of the limits of moderns to absorb and integrate information. And for this reason, Benjamin's arguments about our capacity for the kind of memory that nurtures integrative experience have always struck me as persuasive. If we wonder why younger students might complain about being assigned a short novel like The Great Gatsby, we might also worry about how time to degree for graduate students preempts certain kinds of deep reading, the very intellectual and scholarly kind of reading for lineages that Dr. Comay engages in, that once distinguished graduate work in comparative literature. Now the stage is dominated by research which discovers information, corrals it into paragraphs, and then reports. The report that requires at most a limited sense of intellectual history treats each publication opportunity as an empty now that it fills up with something new. When the form of information dominates our praxis and metrics, the result is Philistinian denigration of infinite work, the temporality of reading that might not ever end, that will never arrive at any kind of closure that isn't provisional. Yet the barrage of information, like the barrage of stimuli threatening Freud's phylogenetic vesicle and beyond the pleasure principle, has been our fate as well. And so are the defense mechanisms which protect us from being overwhelmed at the expense of reflective reading practices. Genuine reflection is inductive and open-ended. Publication metrics are its enemy, which is why it's so exhilarating to read Dr. Comay reading. Writing with Frank Ruda on Hegel's recourse to dashes in the last sentences of the Phenomenology of Spirit and the first sentence of the Science of Logic, we must learn to see a punctuation mark that deflects us, that ushers us out of the text. Anyone who is familiar with Paul de Man's Resistance to Theory essay knows that his resistance to theory actually translates into a resistance to reading. And what you might have guessed is that Dr. Comay's work transcends this resistance and enacts precisely the kind of close reading practices that de Man is calling for. De Man emphasized the need to attend to the tensions between the denotative and the connotative levels of a text, and in particular, to respect the text's ineluctable materiality as marks on a page. In consonance with this standpoint, Dr. Comay recognizes that one cannot generate an interpretation without amplifying a connotative valence. For the very elements in writing that reprove thematic reading, reading for the plot or reading for information, the oblique elements, like Hegel's dashes, that we might be prone to skip over because they rebuff the prospect of coherent thought. Every dash, as Comay and Ruda write, introduces a moment of uncertainty in reading. As a punctuation mark, the dash displays a puzzling temporal and syntactic ambiguity. Its orientation is simultaneously retrospective and prospective. Does the punctuation mark a break, an interruption, a continuation, a detour, a hesitation, a prolongation, a premature termination? The dash combines hesitation and acceleration. It both holds back and propels. It both suspends speech and drives it forward. It scatters and connects. It corrects and confirms. It is in the course of trying to move past the multi-directional dash in its polysemy and obliqueness that Comay and Ruda define the work of philosophical thought. As they write, philosophy brings us to see what is invisible in plain sight. It teaches us to stumble. There is an embrace of humility here that counters a blind self-sovereignty performed as deductive coherence, a sovereignty that disavows what is right in front of it, if this it does not confirm the performance of self-management. This is the humility that remains tied to reality because it assumes a risk of failure, a potentially generative stumbling. Because this stumbling is constitutive rather than incidental in thinking and reading, it is the thing that pitches forward an overwhelmed, insular, and increasingly reified survival in space and time as death-driven stasis beckons on all fronts. Without further ado then, I'd like to yield the platform to Rebecca Comay for her first lecture entitled Hegel, the End of Art and the Endgame of Theater. As you will have seen from the poster, her second lecture is entitled Dialectic, Tragedy and Revolution in the 18th Brumaire, which will take place Thursday at 3:30, and her third lecture, Senile Demented Dialectic, Beckett and Tragedy, will take place on Monday, March 28th at 3:30. Let's all give Dr. Comay a big hand and welcome her.
Did I start? Can you hear me? Yeah. So first of all, thank you, Karen, for that truly embarrassing introduction. That if I could, yes, if I could be a fraction of all the things you've said, I would be very, very proud. So I'm sure I can only disappoint from here on in, but thank you. It's so nice to be here and to see you again and to, resume our conversations that haven't taken place in a long time, too long. And for starting up this this visit, which has taken like so many years to happen. So thanks also to Christopher for his what is now 2 years of postponements and reschedulings and correspondences about this COVID after COVID, and I think so it's good we're finally doing it online, although I wish we were, I wish we could have done it in person. And anyway, it's really great to be here, and thank you everybody for making this visit so far so seamless. It's really great. Yes, as Karen was mentioning, this kind of was cooked up a couple of I guess three years ago now, when I was first invited. I was to give it in 2020 and 21 and 22 now. And I'm still working under the rubric and under the titles that I, sent off in 2019, dramaturgy or dramaturgies of the dialectic. The thing has kind of moldered a bit under COVID conditions, and it's mutated quite a bit. And in some ways it feels less finished. So what I want to do today and in the, for the remainder of these sessions is to kind of give some indications of the kinds of things I've been thinking about vis-a-vis Hegel and the, and particularly the long tail following Hegel, which is in a sense more my interest, and how this, how this connects to what I think are some of the most urgent, both aesthetic and political issues we face today, and and to try to explore how these issues may be overlapping. So there's kind of three terms here, that I'm working with: dialectic, tragedy, and revolution, all of which seem to me to be connected, all of which seem to be troubled in some way. I mean, they're working in a rather, they're making different demands and suggesting different things than they were in their heyday, whenever that was. And this to me is a very interesting thing. So yeah, so I'm going to take today I'm going to take a kind of nosedive into Hegel's aesthetics, the actual Hegel's actual aesthetics, the text that came out of his repeated lecture series that he gave in the 1820s in Berlin, which were cobbled together posthumously and somewhat controversially, it must be said, by one of his students. I want to take a nosedive into the aesthetics and explore some of its ramifications. Then next time and the time after, I'm going to be working slightly adjacently to this, but I'm hoping that what I do today is going to resonate. So my question today is really, today and henceforth, it's really a very simple one. It may sound like a rather stupid one. I'm asking, does the dialectic have a genre? And if it did, would it be tragic or comic? The question is not, although it might sound so, the question is not whether the dialectic is pessimistic or optimistic, whether it has a happy or a sad ending. And it's not the question whether Hegel's system is panlogicist or pantragic, as the question is sometimes posed. These questions aren't unrelated, but I'm nudging in a slightly different direction. Brecht, or one of his fictional characters, professed to find Hegel's logic the funniest thing ever. And this is, I think, the longest quote I'm going to read to you today, or hopefully all week. If we could just have the first PowerPoint slide, that would be great. So it's a good one, so I'm going to just read it. For humor, I always think of the philosopher Hegel. He had the makings of one of the greatest humorists among the philosophers. I read his book, The Great Logic, the Big Logic, as it's sometimes called, because it was also a little one, when I had rheumatism and couldn't move. It's one of the greatest humorous works of world literature. It treats of the way of life of concepts, these slippery, unstable, irresponsible existences, how they abuse each other and fight with knives and forks, and then sit down together to supper as though nothing had happened. They can live neither with nor without each other. His name, Hegel's name for the wit or the joke of some matter, was dialectic. Like all humorists, he tendered this with a deadly serious face. I've yet to meet a humorless person who understands Hegel. And that's great. Thank you. I can take that down. That's one of the best. That's one of the best things that I think has ever been written about Hegel. Maybe there is something funny. Maybe there is something inherently ridiculous, not just about Hegel, but about all philosophy. And perhaps Aristophanes put his finger on it in The Clouds when he put ideas and arguments on stage, the right logos and the wrong logos dressed up as walking, talking personifications. We speak all the time of thought taking a life of its own or getting away from us, or we get attached to ideas. We treat ideas as if they were actual things and treat things as if they were people. They torment us and run away from us, and we pledge our fealty to them. And it's kind of funny, but can be depressing. And I'm trying to think exactly why. Philosophy is, I think, the very epitome of a real abstraction. Real in that it really is there, and it makes abstraction real. Hegel is not simply making a metaphorical flourish in the phenomenology of spirit when he describes the shapes of spirit as coming on the scene or as stepping on stage. They make an appearance like a parade of characters stepping on the stage one after another. And he's not simply speaking metaphorically when he compares the birth of self-consciousness to the raising of a curtain. The subject discovers itself the moment it realizes that there is nothing behind the veil of appearances, nothing to look at behind the screen except what it puts there, nothing happening behind the curtain except for what it, that is to say, the subject, does there. Consciousness is self-consciousness because the world it discovers is a world in which it must find or invent itself. That not only makes for some pretty dramatic discoveries and surprises, but the process is essentially dramatic or dramaturgical. The subject discovers itself as an active and acting subject in every sense. One way to put this, another way to put this is as follows. Thinking is a practice. It needs to put itself into practice, which means it has to put itself out there. It has to perform, demonstrate, show its stripes, and it can only do so in the company of others. Kind of needs an audience of some sort, but it also has to decide what an audience is and what it means to be an audience and to be acting. Thinking has to measure itself. It has to measure up to itself. It has to take the measure of its convictions and take the measure of its own measure. It has to test itself against the idea of itself, must answer to itself, and must make itself answerable to others. That's just thinking, according to Hegel. And this immediately produces an impasse. Something goes wrong in the execution. There's an immediate discord between a thought and its realization, between theory and practice. As soon as you test the waters and you have no choice but to do so, things turn out exactly the opposite of how you thought they would. Everything proves to be the opposite of what it seemed to be. Everything flips around, undoes itself in seeking to realize itself. And this doing is its realization. This drive to self-destruction is unavoidable, thoroughgoing, and incorrigible because it's not just the pathology of thought alone, or to put it more precisely, thought is never just thought. The error or the misfire turns out to be not just in our heads. It's not a question of faulty judgment, but in reality itself, and this hurts. Thinking is also practice in the more narrow sense, in that it needs to practice. Like any actor, it must rehearse its moves. It has to repeat, remember, work through its part, and practicing is its way of learning. The difference, though, from normal acting, from conventional acting, at least as Hegel stages it, is that remembering turns out to be almost entirely improvisatory, and that despite the blinding revelations and despite all the rehearsing and repetitions, the lessons learned are somehow rarely retained. So it practices, and the practice doesn't actually commit anything to memory, and it remembers, and in remembering, it does something completely different. So that's a strange kind of theatrical regime. Negativity, reversal, crisis, breakdown, suffering, the propulsive force of contradiction. Could we say that the dialectic and the tragic, or dialectic and tragedy, if we're to dispense with definite articles, which I'm going to come to in just one moment, are the very same? That's how Peter Zonde characterized German philosophy around 1800. That time of intellectual ferment, when every German philosopher was kind of feeding on Greek tragedy and discovering in Greek tragedy, or I should rather say in a very, very small and not necessarily representative handful, meaning 2 or 3 Greek tragedies, the kind of mirror of its, that is, say, philosophy's own problematic. So if we could just have the, so Zondi writes, the tragic is a mode, a particular manner of destruction that is threatening or already completed, the dialectical manner. There is only one tragic downfall, the one that results from the unity of opposites, from the sudden change into one's opposite, from self-division. So this appears on his extremely provocative and kind of amazing and slightly insane essay on the tragic, where he essentially not only identifies the dialectic with tragedy, but identifies tragedy, or what he calls the tragic, with the dialectic as such. So here's another long quote. I was lying. I do have actually two long quotes. So if you could bring it back again, that would be great. Thank you. Since Aristotle, he says, there's been a poetics of tragedy. Only since Schelling, Hegel's pal, has there been a philosophy of the tragic. Composed as an instruction in writing drama, Aristotle's text strives to determine the elements of tragic art. Its object is tragedy, not the idea of tragedy. The philosophy of the tragic arises like an island above Aristotle's powerful and monumental sphere of influence. Begun by Schelling in a thoroughly non-programmatic fashion, the philosophy of the tragic runs through the idealist and post-idealist periods, always assuming a new form. If one counts Kierkegaard among the German philosophers and leaves aside his students, such as Unamuno, the philosophy of the tragic is proper to German philosophy. In other words, the tragic is German. Until this day, the concept of the tragic has remained fundamentally a German one. This takes a lot of unpacking, and I'd like to just keep this thought on the back burner for the time being. I've been speaking about the dialectic as if it came equipped with an allegorical or heraldic majuscule, as if it were one thing, and as if there were one and only, and even as if it were a person. Jameson has commented on the oddity that we speak this way, the slide from dialectical to dialectics to the dialectic. And the definite article, this urge for definiteness and definitiveness, is revealing. What is it in dialectic that wants to be the dialectic? Dialectic is always a claim to dialectic. It's a contest between one dialectic and another, dialectic pitted against an earlier dialectic or fighting against a worse one. Dialectic is continually reestablishing and reasserting its prestige and pedigree. For Aristotle, it was Zeno. For Hegel, rummaging through the history of European philosophy in search of a precursor, it was Heraclitus and a few others. For Marx, of course, it was Hegel himself, which is just to say that dialectic is caught up in an essential struggle for genealogy and legacy. It is that struggle. It's mired down in its own reception history. It's both an inheritance and a legacy, spurning ancestors, spawning progeny, caught up in an endless drama of succession. And that's why dialectic is not only about conflict, it is itself in a permanent state of conflict as a contest and combat against usurpers. There's a good and a bad dialectic, there's agon and ambivalence. The dialectic is always shadowed by semblances, doubles, imposters, interlopers. For Plato, the problem was perhaps dialectic's proximity to eristic. For Aristotle, its proximity to rhetoric, to the rhetoric which formed its counterpart, or Aristotle even calls it its outgrowth. For Kant, who was the only person who tried to opt out of the succession drama, the dialectic was itself the problem, a kind of sophistry, these are his words, and a cloak for every empty assertion. Dialectic, which resulted in the kind of paralysis of an immobile antinomy, the very opposite of movement or generation, was the thing to escape, control, or overcome. Easier said than done, as Kant's own critical experiment makes clear. And that is why, since Hegel, people have never stopped trying to rescue the dialectic from the dialectic, that is, from Hegel's dialectic, to turn it upside down or inside out, to flip it from head to feet, to extract the critical, what Marx calls the critical and revolutionary kernel from its mystical carapace. For Engels, it was about stripping away the veil of mystery, again, his words, in which the dialectic had been enveloped by idealist philosophy. He wanted to distill the dialectic to pellucid clarity and brevity. This is why he managed to reduce it to the three great laws of motion governing nature: unity of opposites, quantity into quality, negation of the negation. Later, it would be a question of rescuing the dialectic from its orthodoxies and travesties, that is, from Engels himself, and from what Bookchin called the wooden, often scientific dialectical materialism of Diomat, Histomat, and so on that he had spawned. Today, people talk more about returning the dialectic back to Hegel, especially in academia, exploding all those Hegel myths and legends, rescuing the dialectic from its so-called textbook versions. And it's always the phantom of textbook Hegel that has to be swatted away, which I find kind of interesting. And even Hegel worried about these textbooks, these endless, lifeless formalisms, the moribund and mechanical triplicities, the tendencies to formalize and deaden in transmission. Of course, there are those. So I've just been talking in these last few minutes about various ways of mobilizing and motivating that definite article, to turn dialectic into the dialectic. Of course, there are those who emphatically did not use the definite article, opting instead for pointedly adjectival and adverbial forms: negative dialectic, dialectic at a standstill, even, and I'm referring here to Fanon, stretched dialectic. And these are more the people that I'm going to be drawing on in the days to come. I was half jokingly wondering a few minutes ago whether the struggle for succession, for dialectical succession, and for the succession of the dialectic might be a tragedy or a comedy. One of Hegel's students, Karl Rosenkranz, who wrote a little play on basically on Hegel's deathbed about the clash between Hegel's own heirs, between the right and the left Hegelians, presented actually as a farce. But I'm going to just leave that pass, and I'm going to now segue into the second section, which is to say my nosedive into Hegel's aesthetics, and we'll hopefully be able to bring these things all together, if not today, at the very end of the of my visit. Okay, so here we go. End of art. For friends who sometimes sound like apologists, who often sound like apologists of Hegel, the aesthetics is both an embarrassment and an opportunity. An embarrassment in that Hegel seems here to shrink back from his own greatest insight. By Hegel's own estimation, his achievement was to have overcome Kantian dualism through a series of distinct but interconnected mediations, an overcoming of the dichotomy between sensibility and cognition, between intuition and concept, between nature and freedom. These are not the same dichotomies, but they are not entirely unconnected. In short, the redemption of human freedom through its insertion in the weave of sensuous nature. Ironically, this is ironic. For Kant, It had been the domain of the aesthetic where all these binaries were supposed to have been transcended. In the experience of beauty, and Kant is conspicuously talking about natural beauty, the embodied subject could discover its own freedom in a seemingly rigid, rule-bound universe. For Hegel, in contrast, the experience of beauty, and he is conspicuously talking about artistic and not natural beauty, and this is important, is infinitely more ambiguous. On the one hand, beauty provides a glimpse of the possibility of incarnate freedom. On the other hand, this problem is forcibly and necessarily ephemeral. Both the history and the very concept of art reveals its ultimate untenability as a display and viaduct of freedom. So here's the bad Hegel. Nowhere is this tension between embarrassment and opportunity more pronounced than in Hegel's infamous pronouncement of the end of art. Hegel himself may not have used those actual words. We'll never really know, not having been sitting there in his classroom, but he said something close enough that he may as well have. And in any case, it's the effective history, it's the afterlife of these unforgettable sentences that counts. Could we have the next slide, please? Thanks. Art is and remains a thing of the past. The form of art has ceased to be the highest need of the spirit. No more Homer, Sophocles, and so on. No more Dante, Ariosto, or Shakespeare. The rest is paler and paler. We bow the knee no longer. These are just snippets or sound bites, the kinds of things that I'm sure you've all, that everybody has counted whether or not they've ever picked up picked up the aesthetics or read a word of Hegel. This one knows all this. I mean, these are the kind of catchphrases that have made Hegel probably most well known. So what's the deal? On the one hand, we have changed. Human rationality has developed to a point where it no longer needs and can make use of sensuous images to work out its most burning problems. Art, therefore, has become redundant, unnecessary, ineffective. It's been superseded by more robust forms of reason, and the supersession is the very index of its success. This is why Hegel writes, art only fulfills its highest task when it has placed itself in the same sphere as religion and philosophy. So it only vindicates itself or achieves itself by relativizing itself, by putting itself, in a group, by joining a club, in which it will necessarily be the lesser member, the more inferior member. Art finds dignity in finding this shared vocation, in sharing its project, in finding itself part of the project of religion and philosophy. But this dignification is already a degradation. In joining the ranks of religion and philosophy, art finds itself to be only one way, this is Hegel's word, only one way and not the best way of articulating the demands of spirit. Art ratifies, says Hegel. It finds its meaning, purpose, and legitimation only in philosophy. And on the other hand, art itself has changed. So we've changed. Like, we don't need it anymore because we've got a better way of doing it. On the other hand, art has changed. It has been infected by the very rationality that will have eclipsed it. And a symptom of this decline is precisely art's openness and ability to incite philosophical elucidation. The very existence of a work like Hegel's Aesthetics, both the need for it and the possibility of it, is the compelling proof of this. And there's a historical irony. The moment art becomes art, capital A art, The moment that's identified as an autonomous cultural practice with its own secular institutions, the museum, the concert hall, the theater, and so on, is the moment when it is declared redundant. And it's no coincidence, as many people have noted, that Hegel was writing his aesthetics and delivering his lectures on aesthetics, just basically around the corner from the place where Schinkel's Museum of Art was being constructed, the first national museum, secular collection of art, public display of art to be housed in Germany. Many of the most powerful responses to Hegel's infamous dictum have been Hegelian in spirit. Some have extended or directed this thought in directions, though, that he could not quite have anticipated. Recent uptake has tended to center on the vicissitudes of visual art, which is curious, but kind of understandable. Curious, because there's never been a shortage of doomsday discourse surrounding the other arts, or at least the various genres of art, the end of tragedy, the end of lyric, the sclerosis of the so-called new music, and so on, which is really just to say that art is a historical artifact, and like any artifact, must eventually make its own historicity explicit. But why does the discussion always keep circling around the fate of painting? One might ask more broadly why and when visual art came to function as a synecdoche for art generally. When people talk about art, they're usually talking about what Arthur Danto was once led to awkwardly call the hyphenated compound painting and sculpture. When people talk about artists, they're talking about people in their studio doing stuff. The other arts are just that, arts in the plural. Which is funny. Once art, a capital A art, comes on the scene as a singular plural that is an autonomous sphere with its own institutions, it ceases to function as a unitary and unifying rubric. In becoming a genus, art is monopolized by one of its species and ceases to be a genus. I'm dwelling on this a little bit for a reason. The reasons for this monopoly having to do with visual arts, prestige and efficiency as cultural capital and in generating capital, and also perhaps with its ability to simultaneously blur and reinforce social distinctions. A related factor has to do with painting's specific vulnerability to the reproductive technologies. And by painting, I just mean something extremely broad here, that had historically threatened to make it superfluous or inefficient. And it's a short segue to the more general question as to whether art itself can be distinguished from mass-produced objects. At least since Duchamp, art has been engaging with all these issues melancholically, preemptively, defiantly. It's proved receptive and resilient to the reproductive technologies that had threatened once to make it irrelevant. It's found ways of generating aura from its own disenchantment. Bereft of specific sensuous attributes that distinguish it from other mundane things, the distinction among the arts and between art and non-art has forcibly become a conceptual distinction. And that's why the response to an artwork is essentially no longer, this is beautiful, but rather, this is art. This is an argument that's been extremely elegantly rehearsed by Thierry Deduve, which why? Because the institution, why is it art? Because the institution or the market says so. Art has thus must engage with the vicissitudes of its own institutionalization. It has dabbled in the gray zone between collusion and resistance. It's extracted from its own complicity with institutions the resources for a critique of these institutions, and found in critique the basis for a new artistic practice and a kind of artistic practice. Art has thus forcibly migrated into the museum, the collection, the so-called art world, where the context for every artwork is precisely other artworks, and ultimately the abstraction, which is art itself. And the institution is thus folded into the artwork. Art gestures towards its own exhibition value, and the exhibition itself becomes a kind of artwork. The museum takes the museum to be its object, hence the explosion of exhibitions about exhibitions, restaging previous exhibitions. And my favorite along these lines is the exhibition called Le Vide, which was basically a kind of inventory of every single previous exhibition devoted to the void and reproducing, all those empty rooms that had once presented nothingness for the first time. Since Duchamp, art has dematerialized and rematerialized at a rapid clip, and in ways that seem both to confirm and to defy Hegel's prognosis. Art has become ineluctably reflective about its own practice by bringing the idea of art, the problematic category of art itself, into prominence. It's turned the vulgar question, is this piece of junk really art, into an essential part of the discussion. It's made discussion itself, that is the need for it, part of the discussion. In rephrasing the Kantian affirmation, this is beautiful, as the puzzled question, but is it art? It marks the overflow of the artwork into the discourse it generates, and thus confirms the latent discursivity of the work itself. This is sometimes described as the dematerialization of the artwork, the so-called post-medium condition that seems to erode the specific differences between the different arts and to signal the end of art's singular existence as a concrete sensuous thing. But one could argue that the opposite is true. Dematerialization is in fact rematerialization. The trajectory of contemporary art, by contemporary, I mean just kind of modern, the passage from minimalism through conceptual and installation art to flag a few landing posts, points in a resolutely anti-idealist direction, despite appearances. Rather than demonstrating the supremacy of concept over intuition, of meaning over matter, so-called conceptual art rather demonstrates the obdurate materiality of the concept. In becoming conceptual, the artwork, in fact, points to its own irreducible materiality, the physicality of paint and canvas, the press of bodies in the exhibition space, the tyranny of the built environment, architecture, real estate, urban space, transportation, the global art hub, the palpable disparities of representation, access, prestige, power. Discourse points to its own material conditions. But matter is never simply a matter of stone and pigment. Art demonstrates that matter is always social matter, and that's why art matters. All these are kind of variations on Hegel's most reviled proposition. In inciting and becoming discourse, art seems to have ceded its place to philosophy, or let's just call it theory, and to have rehearsed its decisive exit from the cultural arena. Grand exits, of course, have a tendency to tip into heroism and histrionics. The slamming door is usually a cue for a brave new beginning and tends to function preemptively. That kind of melodrama either forestalls the end or it overleaps it altogether by means essentially of a sectioning of time. It either quarantines the end by saying it's done, I'm done, goodbye. It either quarantines the end by deferring it to a forever pending future, or it quarantines it in the deep freeze of a securely cordoned past. It produces the illusion that the end is still to come or that it's already over and done with. So the only real way to end is to inhabit the ending, to deflate the ending by continually repeating it, to reiterate the ending until ending itself becomes little more than a cliche, a trope, a fading trope, a trope of fading. And that's pretty well what's happened to Hegel's most infamous pronouncement after 2 centuries or more of endless repetition and circulation. Art has ceased to be the highest need of the spirit. We bow the knee no longer. Art is and remains for us a thing of the past. These phrases have become weary with overexposure, but it's the last one in particular. And if we could have I think it's the final slide, that would be great. It's the last one in particular that's always caught my attention. It's not so much the bombast or the pathos of the statement that strikes me as it is its awkward, stuttering phrasing. Art is and remains. Die Kunst ist und bleibt ein Vergangenes. It is and remains, is and remains. The repetition is jarring and suggestive. Not only is art a thing of the past, not only is it past, but it also remains so. Its bygoneness must be made ongoing. So art must persist as past. It must persistently demonstrate its pastness. It must show its pastness to be persistent. And this is why art must continue to hang around, if only in order to keep testifying to its own obsolescence. We need art to keep reminding us that we no longer need it. I don't think I need the slide now, thanks. We need to keep seeing that we no longer need to see it. Art, then, defined by its own undoing, must remain on hand to demonstrate it. This is what Hegel means when he speaks, and I'm quoting him now, of the self-transcendence of art, but within its own sphere and in the form of art itself. In this phrase, he's referring specifically to the pyrotechnics of the endless loopings and self-consumings and self-negations of the romantic fragment. But the logic actually applies to every form of art and to art itself as a self-undoing practice. Art remains, if only to give rigor and specificity to its own ending, which is another way of saying it needs to keep ending, if only to put an end to the heroics. And it can only do so by forcibly multiplying the endings. This is the only way in which it can deflate the prestige of any specific ending or any particular kind of ending by turning the end into a repeated, interminable ending. It just kind of lowers the, it just turns down the volume. There is no one way for art to come to an end, no once and for all ending. Otherwise, it wouldn't be an ending. It would be just one more stage exit, and thus a re-dramatization of the whole thing that's supposed to be ended. So art, whatever it is thus consecrated, and this is why it keeps having to change and reinvent itself to stage its own undoing and to generate an incessant aftermath that it continues to inhabit. So one way of putting the question is to say, just as the definite article of the so often attached to the dialectic is not unconnected to the definite article that keeps getting attached to the end of art, and both these definitenesses themselves are in a way the problem. But I've been rummaging around certain tendencies in visual art for the last little while, but I want to shift the focus to theater for the rest of this session for several interconnected reasons, starting with the banal and yet still a little puzzling after everything fact that the chapter on dramatic poetry, which is Hegel's the very last pages of the aesthetics, literally brings the lectures on the aesthetics to a close. Drama is the final and the highest art. His words, the highest art, says Hegel. in that art at this point exhausts its essential possibilities and can and need progress no further. But the superlative is bewildering, partly because it seems to have nothing to do actually with termination or consummation. Vollendung refers neither to completion nor to historical cessation. If we could have these now, the last slide, I think the very last slide. Even as he declares, thanks, the whole thing over and done with, Hegel describes art as still a work in progress. And he actually expresses his hope, his very pious hope, that art will always rise higher and come to perfection. In this same passage, he even offers the oddly empirical, owl of Minerva-ish prediction, one of the strangest passages in the aesthetics. I couldn't really believe it when I saw it, that it will take thousands of years for art to complete, to fully end itself. The future tense, not to mention the count, is jarring as usual in Hegel. What does it mean for art to have reached its endpoint and yet to still need a few thousand more years to reach the finish line? If nothing else, it suggests that superlative terms, final, highest, fulfillment, Vollendung, must mean something very peculiar in the realm of absolute spirit. The puzzle highlights a pervasive instability within absolute spirit, starting with the paradox that the absolute itself is riven by relativity. Despite or because of its absolute spirit is susceptible to upgrading and degradation. There are degrees of absoluteness. Some absolutes are more or less absolute than others. There's low-grade absoluteness, that's art. There is upgraded, more absoluteness, that's religion. And then there is absolute absoluteness, which is philosophy. And this repetitive escalation of hyperbole is essential to the absolute, or it wouldn't be absolute. All of which is nonsense, of course, for what Hegel calls the understanding, by which he means just common sense, which takes this kind of talk literally and can only think sequentially, quantitatively, chronologically, in terms of steps and stages. The historicist scaffolding of the aesthetics invites this misunderstanding, as does, of course, Hegel's well-known and unfortunate image of the latter. That Hegel pronounces the exhaustion of literature while almost completely ignoring the contemporary novel, and this is the art form that had basically eclipsed German theater at the time that Hegel is writing, makes the verdict even more intriguing. This is the moment when the reading revolution, the so-called reading revolution, inaugurated in post-Gutenberg Germany, the rise of literacy, the explosion in the publishing industry, the expansion of the bourgeois sphere, the turn to increasingly private modes of cultural consumption has come to a pitch in producing a virtual collective brought together in collective solitude in the privacy of their own homes. That's what the novel does for you. For the imaginary nation that was not yet Germany, not yet a state, not yet a nation state, the printed page provided a social glue that would no longer require stone and mortar. Hegel does make reference to this aggregated and atomized sociability, everybody all together, all at once, in isolated enjoyment. You know a little bit about that, when he describes the secular ritual of reading the morning newspaper as his own daily prayer. But maybe he could have tried reading more novels. Hegel's silence on the novel may partly reflect his narrow taste in literature and is consistent with his anti-romantic animus, but it's no small elision. The novel, the roman, was the romantic genre par excellence. Schlegel had crowned Wilhelm Meister one of the three great tendencies of the epoch, The other two being the French Revolution and Fichte's Wissenschaftslehre, so the bar is high. The novel is also the genre, again, according to Schlegel, where literature and theory, poetry and criticism converge. Poetry generates its own criticism. Criticism becomes a mode of poetry. At the cusp between poetry and philosophy, the novel is the exemplar of literary theory in both senses of that word. Here's Hegel's plot summary of Goethe's novel. Here he goes. The subject sows his wild oats. However much he may have quarreled with the world or been pushed around in it, at last he gets his girl and some kind of position, marries her, and becomes as good a Philistine as everybody else. So that's the Bildungsroman for you. Hegel's dismissiveness is impressive, but if nothing else, it demonstrates that by the end of the lectures, Hegel has abandoned the dubious chronological framework that had structured the aesthetics to this point. The speculative hierarchy cuts against every naturalist, historicist, and evolutionary metric. So the point is that there is a novel. Hegel doesn't bring the novel into the picture. So the last form of, the last form of art, which is drama, has no other art into which to precipitate. It doesn't precipitate into the prose art that is the novel, even though it was sitting right there, and empirically speaking, it had done so. It has nowhere to go, but to catapult into philosophy. So we're no longer moving from one art to another. We're moving from art altogether into this other genus altogether. But the finality of drama is peculiar for other reasons too. Dramatic poetry is highest precisely because it is most effective. Its privilege stems precisely from its incompletion and from its peculiar relationship to transience. I think I should just go turn on a light. It's a little bit later here than it is there. Just 1 second. Okay. All art confesses to its limitation. All art has a tendency towards self-cancellation. All art is dedicated to staging its own demise. All art fails in that sense, but drama fails better. Drama is incomplete on several grounds, each stemming from Hegel's decidedly non-Aristotelian emphasis on performance. The action has to be enacted in the presence, can't just be told, it has to be enacted in the presence of others, real bodies, on a real stage, performing in real time, in real space, singing and dancing before a real audience, using real stage props and costumes, what Hegel calls a completely scenic presentation. Reading a play or even hearing it recited is insufficient. Hegel goes so far, and I'm going to return to this, as to recommend that play texts remain unpublished. This, of course, goes against the grain of Aristotle's Poetics, for one, where the discomfort with stagecraft leads Aristotle to the point of suggesting that it might just be good enough, or maybe even better, to hear the story, or just to read it, or maybe even just to think about it to get the cathartic payoff. Just think of Oedipus and you get the shivers. But it also jars with the 19th century German tendency to read drama as literature, and specifically with the German idealist metabolization of tragedy as the tragic, that's what we're thinking about just like towards the beginning, a tendency that had turned theater into a closet drama, a text, a teaching opportunity, a trove of philosophical exemplars, a drama of ideas, an idea of drama. Hegel is virtually unique among his contemporaries in resisting this literarification or textualization of theater, which is actually quite impressive, given that actually couldn't go see Greek tragedies on the stage in those days. They barely made it into translation. So it's a kind of interesting insistence. But it also crashes against the overtly idealist scaffolding of the aesthetics Am I okay for time? Yeah, okay. The trajectory to this point has been driven by the increasing dematerialization of the artwork, a progressive reduction, lessening, or waning of weight, density, extension. From architecture to sculpture to painting to music to poetry, because that's the way it's moving along, from the spatial to the temporal arts. The artwork has been physically shrinking. It's literally taking up less and less space. So we move from a three-dimensional space, which contains a way of the architecture as a way of containing space, to sculpture as a way of occupying space, to painting as the flat thing on the wall, the two-dimensionality, and so on, to music taking up no space, etc. And that is why poetry wins the laurel in the paragone of the art forms. It is both spatially and ontologically compact. Having dispensed with all extrinsic materiality, poetry has no need to forage outside its domain to produce and reproduce itself. The poem needs language and operates on language in a different way than the statue needs marble or the painting needs pigment. That's why poetry is uniquely expressive of human freedom. It's the only art capable of portraying humanity using purely human material. In other words, unlike all the other arts, whose material is basically natural stuff, a natural resource which has to be transformed or spiritualized and turned into a spiritual nature, into human product. The material of poetry is a ready-made. I mean, it's working with language. And the language, which has become second nature, which has become essentially, dead and inert, and this has to be re-enlivened. That is why. So that is why speech alone is the element worthy of the expression of spirit. So that's poetry. Dramatic poetry, which is dramatic poetry, which is a species of poetry. Dramatic poetry abruptly reverses this movement of idealization by reinstating materiality with a vengeance. As dramatic, it undermines the premise on which rests its own privilege as poetry. So having just exalted poetry as the most ethereal or dematerial spiritual art of all, Hegel proceeds to elevate drama as the highest form of poetry, defining drama in terms that completely contradict what he privileges about poetry. So it's a very odd moment. As dramatic, yes, it undermines the premise on which rests its own privilege as poetry. Language is not all. Theater is not literature. In drama, language incompletes itself. It incompletes itself in performance. It stages its own insufficiency by calling for a supplement that will always be insufficient for several reasons. And I'm just going to go through a few of these, and maybe we can, pause for discussion. First, as a performance, theater needs its audience in a way that the other art forms do not. Its spatial and temporal coordinates are not its own. The play occupies the same space and time as its audience and has no existence apart from it, which is clearly not the case of a sculpture whose space you cannot share, or a painting. You're not allowed to go too close to it. Whereas the play is the room. We're in the same time. We're in the same space. This means it's dependent on a host of contingencies that it can neither anticipate nor control. It's vulnerable to the vicissitudes of reception. It's dependent on a public that's inherently, Hegel deplores, distracted and dispersed, atomized by the centrifugal pressures of civil society, by the disparities of cultural privilege, and by the arbitrariness of opinion. Reflecting on what he calls the haphazard composition of the contemporary theater-going public, Hegel remarks that here in Germany, anarchy reigns. Everyone pronounces judgment out of their own head, approves or condemns according to the accidental dictates of their personal views, feelings, or caprices. So that's the first. So that's the first incompletion, right? It's not sufficient. It can't dictate the terms of its own reception, and it needs to. It cares about it. It's not indifferent. It can't be indifferent to it. Second, dramatic poetry is not strictly poetry because it doesn't narrate but has to act out its content. The play is subject to a time pressure that forces it to relinquish its autonomy and purity of medium. Unlike epic, which has all the time in the world, and unlike lyric, this is the literary dyad, which drama is kind of overcoming and in some way mediating and transcending. Unlike epic, which has all the time in the world, and unlike lyric, which manages to condense or suspend time to make time not matter, theater is constitutively strapped for time. It does not have the time to tell its story using words alone. No time to describe a setting, to unpack a situation, to explore an environment. No time to meander along the byways from Troy to Ithaca. Concentrated, simplified, focused on the impending collision, drama hurtles forth precipitously, iambically, with an unstoppable momentum. This leaves no time for elaboration, and yet the drama is obliged to provide it. It doesn't have the luxury of epic dilation, and yet it must do justice to the objective. So to save time, poetry must share its space. This is why drama, I'm quoting Hegel here, needs the aid of all the other arts, The set must be built, the scenery painted, the music sung, the bodies moved around the stage like animated sculptures. It needs those because it doesn't have time. Language does not, it doesn't have time just to say it. So it needs to, you can't tell, it's got to show. The stage then is the site of an assemblage of heterogeneous arts that are neither autonomous nor subsumed. There is no Gesamtkunstwerk, no meta or mega art that would be able to unify the disparate elements, only a kind of consortium of disaggregated elements where each art jostles for dominion and none retains it for long. What's initially enlisted as what Hegel calls an aid or accompaniment to language quickly turns into an insubordinate rival. Music threatens to break away and attract attention to itself. Dancing distracts, the stage impinges. Theater thrusts into view the discordant multiplicity of all the arts, and in this way unravels the category of art itself as a unitary and unifying genus. This threatens to ruin the medium specificity that's organized and propelled the aesthetics to this point. Every art marks the boundary separating it from every adjacent art. Every art defines itself by carving out its own frontier and by making its own limitation explicit. To establish itself as art, it must identify as an art. This is why medium specificity is so crucial here. To be art, you can't just be art, you have to be an art. And it can only do so by showing that it fully identifies with its medium and that it can assert its exclusive claim to this medium. So just to take a couple of examples here. Sculpture has to demonstrate that it's solely and uniquely sculpture, that it exists as no other art does, as pure volumetric space alone. It must prove that it is not painting. And so it unpaints itself, it depaints itself. It must make its unpaintedness conspicuous. And that's why Hegel dwells so long on the supposed whiteness of Greek sculpture, and why he's so preoccupied with the importance of the statue's blank, unseeing gaze. The blankness confirms an essential absence of color. And I'm stressing essential. The absence is essential because it is actually unperturbed by the empirical presence or absence of actually existing color. Hegel knew perfectly well what he was saying. He read art history. He was up to date. He was well informed about the recent discoveries of ancient polychromatic sculpture. He knew that those those sculptures didn't look like gleaming, Renaissance white marble bodies. But that doesn't matter. It has no bearing on its argument. Paint, the fact of paint, does not impinge on the essential unpaintedness of sculpture. The statue is white, no matter what its color. This is very, very bizarre train of thought here. So the statue erodes itself. It sloughs off its color like flaking paint. The pigment fades away even before the weather can get to it. And just so, in turn, painting must prove that it is not sculpture, non-sculpture. It desculpts or unsculpts itself. It must define and mark itself as sculpture's other. And painting does this by laying claim to the color disavowed by sculpture. This is why it's color and not draftsmanship that's so essential to painting. So in rehearsing the old, debate, the paragone between colore and disegno, between color and and drawing or design between Venice and Florence, sort of. Hegel sides with Titian over Michelangelo. And it disavows sculpture's dimensionality by making its own flatness explicit. Through shading and perspective, the painting demonstrates that it can conjure up three-dimensional space without needing to occupy it. It represents volume. It produces the semblance of volume and thus proves it doesn't need it. And one by one, I won't go through everything, one by one, the arts repel each other in this manner. Within the virtual museum, which is Hegel's aesthetics, the arts coexist virtually in a kind of negative, ekphrastic assemblage in which each exists by asserting its exclusive and exhaustive claim to its one and only and its own specific medium. Every art negatively conjures up every other art in order to exclude it. And theater, which is basically the collision course between all these interdependent arts. Theater disturbs this uneasy negative cohabitation, which defines art or the arts as such. So third, this can probably be my last one. Third, the experience of theater is uncontainable within the confines of the theater. Since the Renaissance discovery or invention of the so-called Aristotelian unities, everybody has been, which is sort of since forever, everybody has been worrying about the issue of duration. How long is too long? How short is too short? What is the measure of drama? And just remember Aristotle's flurry of stipulations. How long should it be? A drama must be long enough to command our attention. It has to be short enough for us to take in as a whole. It has to be expansive enough to bear scrutiny. It has to be compact enough to remember. So bigger than a microbe, smaller than a 1,000-mile long animal. It's strange, I think, that Aristotle is worrying so much about this, given his professed indifference to the exigencies of live performance. For Hegel, and this is really interesting, there's no adequate length of time for theater. Drama necessarily lacks for time. It suffers from a constitutive shortage of time, and this lack must be made explicit. It must become it is part of the theatrical experience, and it must be made part of it. Regardless of length, there is never enough time. Every play ends too soon. Every performance moves too quickly for the spectator to absorb, comprehend, or reflect on within the time of the actual performance. So drama has an inherent haste, no matter what its pace and no matter what its actual length. Drama has an inherent haste, an over hastiness that epic refuses and that lyric seems not to register. And this precipitation, this hastiness is essential to its functioning as drama. Drama is drama because it gives no breathing space, no pause to reflect on possibilities. And unlike the novel, by the way, which you can, put down and come back to and read at your own pace, drama, forces a pacing that is not your own and to which you structurally cannot keep up with. Drama gives no breathing space, no pause to reflect on possibilities. And this means that there's always something left over, a kernel of unprocessed experience that the spectator is forced to take home with them. Whatever happens in the theater does not stay in the theater. The experience of theater is incomplete within the theater and must be completed afterwards. Unlike a sculpture or a painting, which doesn't care how long you stand there, and unlike music, which coincides exactly with the time of its performance, drama is afflicted by a constitutive discord between the time of performance and the time of reception. So it's the immediacy of performance that preempts the possibility of immediate or timely reception. And this incompleteness is essential to the theatrical experience. And to ensure that this experience is this incompleteness is experienced, noted, and that this discomfort is registered, that the spectator, to make sure the spectator registers this temporal discord. This is why Hegel recommends that play texts remain unpublished. You just don't want to be too prepared, because if you pre-read it or pre-prepare it, you may just miss the missing. You may miss the discomfort of having it actually pass you by, and thus you will, not enter this kind of structural aftermath, which Hegel defines as being essential to the experience of theater. What is the time? I think maybe I should stop. Yeah.
5 o'clock.
Okay.
4:58.23.
It's your 5 o'clock. Oh my God.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Rebecca. I'm just going to check our question and answer section to see if we have any questions, because if not, I'm going to start questioning. I don't see any questions yet, so maybe while people are formulating their ideas for questions, I'm gonna start. I think maybe my first question is going to be quite predictable, given the nexus of things that we hold in common. It's an insinuation that, I heard in your talk today, but also, well, I've been reading, the Dash over the weekend, and also a prior lecture I heard of yours, and also, the morning sickness book, which I also have read, that, it's almost like philosophy is involved in a repetition compulsion, and which, in keeping with the psychoanalytic implotment of that, or at least Freud's implotment, is something that's triggered by anxiety, or traumatic anxiety, the sort of belated anxiety following a potentially traumatic event. And it seems like in your characterization of the notorious end of art claim in Hegel, that you're characterizing that almost like it's a trauma that, then theory ends up having to work through. Or I've seen it characterized like that before. The idea that the end of art is the beginning of theory, right? Mm-hmm. Then there are the sort of subsequent avatars of this argument that you hear especially loud at the beginning of Adorno's aesthetic theory, and then also subsequently in George Steiner's The Death of Tragedy. And even, Lyotard's embrace of the sublime, which is very Adorno-esque, if you will. And so I'm just wondering if there's a point at which this working through is the only kind of operation that the idea of art can have, from a Hegelian standpoint, but maybe also a post-Hegelian standpoint. Like, do you see anything beyond like art as a kind of new determinate negation of its own possibility? And it seems like you're all these people have identified some sort of art that stands in as a synecdoche for all the other art. So Adorno was he oscillated between literature and music, but music was the thing. George Steiner obviously is tragedy. Lyotard is looking at painting. But it seems like once you take the standpoint that all these arts are negating each other and that thereby determining their own specificity, that you're moving beyond the synecdoche, that the tendency of synecdoche in the discussion of art. And yet theater ends up being the one that you turn to elaborate a sort of, the insufficiency between the supplement and the language that requires it. So I guess, if given the logic of trauma, which from my standpoint is that, you have to compulsively repeat something until it gets boring.
Right.
Then do we know that we're really at the end of art when we find art boring? And how would you know? And this is sort of like the question that I would pose to a conspiracy theorist who talks about lizard people. Like, how do I know I'm not a lizard person? How do I know that the reason I find art boring is because maybe I've come to the end of that traumatic working through? Or is it because I'm a Philistine? Are Philistines people who don't appreciate art because they've already worked through this trauma?
Right. And that's why, these are all really great questions. There's so many questions in there. I mean, I just wanted to say, I do want to make maybe gesture towards Beckett in this regard, which is kind of where I want to end up in next week, I guess. But because, Beckett seems to me the person, it's super juice hyperbole is like the person most, but he's certainly, Beckett's so interesting for a number of ways, like after reading Hegel, while reading Hegel. First of all, Beckett, himself like cycles through all the art forms. Like he just writes novel, poetry, plays, movies. He just kind of basically cycles through every single medium as if, just like not exactly exhausting them, but nonetheless finding none of them sufficient in some way. That's the first point. But the second point is a more interesting one, since you're talking about boredom. I think this is the deflationary. This is what has to. This does have to do with the desire or the fantasy of an end, of articulating an end that is that's going to be completely unheroic. That's just not going to. So yes, boring. I mean, that's like, how do you, and it's not making the boring interesting necessarily. It's not kind of finding this kind of aura in disenchantment. It's actually is living in that, just living in that ongoing endedness in a way which does not reinstate. It doesn't actually permit nostalgia. Nor is it exactly, since you talk about theory, nor is it exactly theory either. It's not exactly, although, philosophers always love Beckett, because it seems to have such good ideas, and it seems to lend itself to philosophical, if not paraphrase, at least. But it also, I'm looking at this cat across.
That's common.
What was I going to say? Yeah, it does. It also resists that, whatever it's doing, it is resisting the transposition or move into theory, I think, in some real way. Not because it's so beautiful that it can't be captured or something, but it seems to be a very powerful resistance to theory. And as such, endlessly absorbing. Does that connect at all to what you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, it's just this worry that I would have, which is that when I'm not connecting with a work of art, either I'm not having this sort of almost like an oceanic feeling about it, or I'm not identifying with it, and therefore I find myself sort of numb. Is that a moment of ignorance, a moment of Philistinian, deflection, or is it because I've worked through the trauma and I'm post-traumatic? But on the other side of it, the logic of hearing the end of art as a kind of identification of a traumatic origin almost suggests another possibility of the return of the repressed, which is I think kind of where Adorno ends up going in the aesthetic theory, which is that when art works, it's going to be uncanny. It's doing its work, and when it's not doing its work, it's going to be affirmative, right? And so that suggests almost like that Nietzschean logic of first nature, second nature, that art almost has to recall first nature in order to somehow challenge second nature, or second nature beings who are receiving the art form. So I don't know. That would be
Adorno. Yeah, that would be Adorno.
Those are some of the thoughts I had while I was listening, because it seems like when Hegel says that he's also opening the door for critique to displace the practice of making art, and then there's the idea that theory itself becomes like art, and maybe therefore artful, in trying to produce the kind of effects that would redeem art from its premature death. But this is maybe I'm taking the logic of.
But you think it's a question of redeeming art from its premature death, or just also freeing art from an assignation, which which had become naturalized or second naturalized. I mean, so for example, when Hegel, everybody laments the fact that Hegel says, oh, art, is no longer, fulfilling the highest, in its highest vocation, is no longer fulfilling the need of spirit, whatever it is, whatever he says, but maybe that's a good thing, right? And maybe that need has to be, maybe art shouldn't be doing that. Maybe it's not just, because it feels very, in a sense, it feels very undialectical to say, oh, art is no longer adequate to its concept, as if its concept was stable somehow. I mean, maybe that it in turn, has been transformed, precisely by art itself, which means art is doing, it's not just bad philosophy or inferior theory or something like that. Maybe it's actually doing something, it's being sprung free, or it's sprung itself free to do, a different kind of work. And that means, in Hegelian terms, to forge a different relationship between spirit and nature. So that's, that which would be quite a liberating thought.
If it's possible to think liberation at this moment. That might be a good articulation. Does somebody else want to have a question?
Can I chime in?
Sure.
Since I don't see any questions on Q&A, and you've been carrying the questions. So Rebecca, could you say more about what Hegel had against the novel? Because I've always been fascinated by those 2 pages at the end of the consideration of romantic art, where he basically decries, you quoted them, it was the Philistine passage.
About Wilhelm Meister. Yeah.
Where like
It's
he
amazing.
is it against inwardness? Is it against this mode of subjectivity? Because in literature today, we attach so much political agency to the novel.
I know.
And Hegel is so at odds with that.
It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make, it makes like zero sense. First of all, it may be his, I mean, so the trivial answer would be, oh yeah, it's just Hegel's Philistinism. He just like doesn't, he just can't, he can't deal with contemporary stuff, anything. And it may be, I mean, I take his anti-romanticism seriously. I mean, the novel is just, everybody's loving the novel because it's, that's the romantic genre and so on and so forth. So he's kind of has to kind of put his oar in. But I think, and by the way, not everybody reads Hegel in this way either. I mean, not everybody's so struck by the, by his, by the absence of the novel as I am kind of trying to push right now. But I think the novel, I mean, is, there's something about, we go from, we're trying to go from poetry to prose. And we just can't go from genre to genre. We have to kind of like, we kind of move up into a completely different genus because we just can't, so it's just, so instead of going from poetry qua dramatic poetry qua, theater into drama, we just kind of jump out, altogether into the prose of philosophy, right? So that's not really an answer. It's just an observation. I mean, connected to this, I think is another. I think this is connected. Is another strangeness. If I was not so, if I was not so running out of time, I would have talked more about. I would talked about this, but the aesthetics, sort of opens, closes with this kind of opening up of this couplet, which itself goes nowhere, tragedy comedy, right? And he goes, well, because it's kind of it seems to be a nice little dialectical binary, which is kind of asking for some kind of something, and it doesn't get it. And Hegel kind of entertains, well, wait, maybe is there a way of mediating between tragedy and comedy? And he talks about this sort of, this bourgeois, he discusses this bourgeois drama, which is kind of like a dramedy, like it's just kind of neither here nor there. It's just kind of like, it's so boring. And it's kind of, it's as if he's almost talking about the novel at that point, right? Just something that just kind of, the novel is a kind of reconciling, it's a kind of reconciling genre, and he just doesn't allow it. I mean, there's something, so the novel is, it's there, it's there negatively as this, aesthetic form that has to be blocked. And I don't really know why, actually. What are your thoughts on the novels? I mean,
well, I read it from I was always interested in that part of the aesthetics because the principle of romantic art for Hegel, he says, is reconciliation. And it's just fascinating to me in Canada today that we have a discourse stemming from Hegel about recognition, right? But in the wake of the truth and reconciliation movement, so few people have actually taken up romantic art and its principle of reconciliation.
mm-hmm.
But then Hegel dooms it all to fail, right? In 2 pages,
Right.
He dooms it all to fail. That in fact, the the modern knight and lady, and his
Mhm.
lady in romantic art will, as you quoted the passage, simply become as good a Philistine as anyone.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
reconciliation impossible, and especially impossible today in the novel. And yet, I've had a number of graduate students who want to talk about the novel, say in Indigenous literature, as a means of reconciliation.
Right. It's tricky, isn't it? Because the language of truth and reconciliation is, it's pretty religious language, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, exactly.
Mm-hmm. And is Hegelian, there's so many questions here, like is Hegelian reconciliation like ultimately Christian? Is the and in some sense has he kind of gotten over that? And if it is, that would point to, in a way it would address the question of why not the novel, why not the happy tragedy, the kind of modern bourgeois drama, because the idea of an aesthetic or literary reconciliation would be anathema, and not only for bad reasons, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think we have another question actually on Q&A. Can you see it?
Yeah, would you like me to read it?
Sure.
Okay. Is philosophy adequate to its concept? So the question is, are you aware of Hegel's comments regarding tragedy in the Greeks in his lectures on the proofs? Lecture 12 and 14, in his last days, he decided to commit to a revised version of the phenomenology in a short works on the proofs. Why? Can you see the Q&A too, Rebecca?
I'm looking at it. Is Charles here? The proofs, lectures on the proofs of the existence of God you're talking about?
Yeah, he's going to have to type his answers.
Oh, okay.
I'm allowing him to talk. This is Claire.
Okay. Yeah. Why don't you come in here and so yeah, I see these are two different questions. Can we start with I don't have at my disposal his comments on the tragedy and the Greeks in the lectures on the proof, so I can't really, I don't think I have anything to any response. You must have something in mind though. You see there? You can use your mic. You can just turn on your mic.
Can I?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, well, now I feel really stupid. I thought you might find those comments in particular interesting because he's distancing himself from the Greeks.
Right.
And suggesting there's a reason why we're no longer satisfied with external fate.
Mm-hmm.
And that there's a kind of, I assume, a kind of satisfaction that we can find now, sort of post-Christianity, that the Greeks didn't expect in terms of necessity and a kind of an impersonal fate.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the one idea.
Right. Well, which is that thought is that's consistent with that's certainly consistent with his presentation of his use of Greek tragedy, for example, in the phenomenology, like his use of the Antigone in a very early, very, very early premature moment where, it's clearly not the neither the genre nor the, you know, the organization that's the social organization that's been explored there are adequate, you know, and it is the role of fate, you know, this kind of blind fate that comes along and swallows everybody up is very much part of that inadequacy. So we just, you know, it's not in any way a template at that point. So yeah, no, but thank you. I'd have to look at that. Is it fundamentally different though? I just don't.
I just thought maybe it would be useful and
that's
interesting to you.
interesting. Thank you. Thank you. I would definitely. So what about the revised? What about the revisions? Revisions of the phenomenology.
Go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
What are you thinking?
My thought is actually that he recognized the pedagogical inadequacy of the phenomenology as an introduction, even though it's still a scientific introduction. And he understood the proofs as what should have been the exoteric introduction to a system. But then that sort of brings up this sort of question of philosophy as adequate to itself, to its own concept, as a rationally self-grounding account. So whether philosophy can provide an account of what should really be the case.
Right. And then we have to, I mean, these are such different, because there's the phenomenology, there's the proofs, which are more, which are lectures. So they're very different discursive mode, because it's inside the encyclopedic mode of thinking, rather than phenomenology, which is, you know, all about getting to that point, right? I mean, my impression was that it's really the logic whose revision he was most obsessed with, you know, and thought it would have to be revised 77 times over. And I mean, that's the book that he was completely obsessed with reworking. I mean, he takes the encyclopedia, he makes all these additions, interpolations, he's making these comments, and he's kind of puffing it up all the time, but it's not fundamentally revised. It really is a textbook, and he's just adding stuff. Whereas the logic is the one that he's really redrafting all the time. And that seems significant in a way, because I mean, the phenomenology at one point, like, you know, early on, he says he sees, like, earlier, he's looking at the phenomenology and he's seeing all its flaws. He's like, oh, you know, it's so, but he doesn't see it actually as revisable. Like, he sees it as a historical artifact, and it has to remain as such somehow. Whereas ironically, the logic, which is, you know, in the ether of logic, you know, is something that is self-correcting and in need of alteration, whereas the phenomenology, which is this kind of historical, you know, still mired down in historical experience. I mean, that's the one that, that he thinks is just, it's like a monument. It can't be changed, not because it's perfect at all, because it's imperfect. It can't. So yeah, these are all very different. I mean, these are all very, very different kinds of texts, aren't they?
Yeah, but actually, literally, like, within days of him dying, he'd agreed to produce a revised version of the Phenomenology of Spirit.
I know.
And a book on the proofs for the existence of God.
Right. Maybe he knew he
within literal days.
Maybe he knew he wasn't going to have to do it.
Well, that could be.
because his whole take on the phenomenology that he wasn't going to revise it.
Yeah.
You know, not because it was perfect. He had to kind of, just kind of had to, like, set that imperfection in amber almost.
Why do you think that?
Well, I think that for the reasons, I think for the reasons I was suggesting that that its historicity, had to be respected. Like it was marred by its time, it's marred by its circumstances. He says all these things, and
Well, he says that with respect to the preface, but it's not clear that his comments apply directly to the phenomenology itself, where he insists that that's still the proper scientific introduction of the system.
Sure. Introduction, though, and
Yeah,
not
well,
science. So yeah. So I mean, I guess I'm just intrigued that it's the science. His preoccupation with correcting the science of logic. This is the kind of contingency of the logic is its revisability and its mutability is something that's just completely preoccupying him.
right.
Yeah, no, these are really interesting. Yeah, really interesting thoughts.
Anyway, I was just sort of throwing a couple things out there.
Yeah, no, that's great.
I'll be here all week. Don't worry.
Oh, good.
I'll let others.
Okay, yeah. Well, next time is going to be really, really different kind of lecture, like different kind of talk on Thursday. So,
Wonderful. I look forward to it. Thank you.
great.
So this would be a good time to end.
Okay.
Provisionally.
Okay.
End this art. So because technically we're supposed to end at 5, but it's close to 5:30. Want to give Rebecca a chance to eat dinner if she wants, or whatever she wants to do. And
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, and
for a wonderful talk,
see
and
you on
looking forward to Thursday.
Thursday. Okay.